The applause in the grand auditorium felt like thunder, but the loudest sound was the silence where my name should have been. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Dr. Rowan Vance, though for 20 years, I had allowed that version of myself to become a faint, whispered memory. The applause inside the Grand University Auditorium was a physical force, a wave of thunderous sound that washed over the velvet-seated rows and broke against the brightly lit stage. But for me, sitting cloaked in the shadows of the back row, the loudest sound was the profound, piercing silence where my name should have been. On that stage, bathed in the warm, validating glow of academic prestige, stood my husband, Dr. Julian Croft, and our daughter, Amelia. They were a perfect portrait of intellectual succession, smiling graciously as they accepted the esteemed Bancroft Prize for their co-authored work on proto-linguistic systems in pre-Columbian Andean societies. It was a work built on my research, my original fieldwork, my sleepless nights hunched over dusty texts, a foundation constructed from the very bones of a career I had lovingly and foolishly placed on hold for them. Julian, ever the charismatic orator, stepped up to the microphone, his voice smooth and resonant as it effortlessly filled the vast hall. He spoke of dedication, of late-night inspiration, and of the unique collaborative spirit that had brought their groundbreaking research to life. He thanked the university's board, the endowment committee, and a dozen of his tenured colleagues by name. He then turned to Amelia, his voice thick with paternal pride, thanking her for her fresh, incisive perspective that had been so instrumental in the final stages. His speech was a beautiful, moving eulogy for a career I was, in fact, still living. As he spoke, I watched our daughter, my Amelia. She stood beside him, poised and radiant in a sapphire blue dress, the very image of a rising academic star. It was then that her eyes, the same deep cobalt as my own, scanned the darkened audience and found me. For a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of something recognition, perhaps even discomfort before it was quickly extinguished. Her gaze became cool, dismissive, and she turned her attention back to the adoring crowd. And in that chillingly empty glance, I finally, irrevocably, understood. I had not just been forgotten or overlooked. I had been deliberately and meticulously erased. The drive home was a masterclass in their silent warfare. Julian drove, humming a self-satisfied tune from a classical composer he favored, while Amelia texted furiously in the passenger seat, a small smile playing on her lips as messages from admirers undoubtedly flooded her phone. I sat in the back, an invisible passenger in my own family car, the award statue sitting on the seat between Amelia and me like a golden barrier. The air was thick with their shared triumph, an atmosphere so dense it felt difficult to breathe. When we arrived home, they walked in ahead of me, leaving the front door to swing shut on its own. I caught it just before it latched, the soft click of the lock sounding like a final, definitive closing of a door in my own heart. That night, I lay awake in our cold, quiet bedroom, listening to the steady, untroubled breathing of the man beside me, a man who had shared my bed for 2 decades, yet had just publicly orphaned my life's work. The erasure hadn't begun at the ceremony. That was merely its coronation. It had been happening for years, in small, insidious ways I had chosen to ignore. It was in the way Julian would say, my research, when discussing theories we had developed together. It was in the way Amelia would consult her father on her essays, dismissing my own expertise in the very same field with a casual, "Oh, Mom, your theories are a bit dated. Don't you think thus I'd mistaken poison for academic rigor and dismissal for generational difference?" The days that followed were a descent into a surreal, isolating void. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and I had been rendered inaudible and invisible within the walls of my own home. I would be in the kitchen making coffee, and Julian would walk in, retrieve a mug from the cabinet right beside my head without a word, and walk out as if no one was there. I would try to speak, to ask a question, to make a simple comment about the weather, and my words would simply hang in the air, unacknowledged, until they dissipated into the suffocating silence. Amelia was a more active participant in this psychological warfare. She would hold long, animated phone calls with her friends in the living room while I was sitting right there, recounting the glory of the awards night, never once mentioning my presence. One afternoon, I found her in my study, my personal sanctuary, casually flipping through one of my foundational research journals. "Just looking for some sources for Dad," she'd said breezily when she noticed me, her tone implying that my work was now nothing more than a public archive for their use. My desire, my desperate, aching need, was no longer for praise or recognition, but for a simple acknowledgement, a confirmation that I was not a ghost haunting the hallways of my own life. I needed to know if I was going mad, or if this cruelty was as real as it felt. The breaking point arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet whisper of aging paper on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in Julian's home office, a room that had once been our shared intellectual sanctuary, now feeling like his personal throne room. I was searching for an old monograph I needed for a piece of freelance editing, one of the small ways I kept my mind sharp and connected to the world that had been stolen from me. His new award sat gleaming on the mahogany desk, catching the afternoon light and casting a long shadow across the room, tucked away on a lower shelf, behind a row of newer, glossier publications bearing his and Amelia's names. I found what I was looking for: the final, bound manuscript of their prize-winning book. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled it out, a strange premonition settling in my gut. I knew what I would find, or rather, what I wouldn't. I turned to the dedication page, a page that in every draft I had reviewed over 2 years had read, "For Rowan, my partner and inspiration, without whom none of this would be possible." Now, the page was stark, pristine white. The words were gone, leaving behind only a cold, empty space that screamed louder than any accusation. It was a digital deletion that had become a physical, tangible void. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird beating against its cage. I sank into Julian's leather chair, the manuscript feeling impossibly heavy in my lap. I flipped through the pages, the text a blur of familiar theories, data points and arguments, all born from my intellectual labor. Then, something slipped from between the pages of the back cover and fluttered to the floor. It was a single printed sheet, an email from Amelia to Julian, dated 6 months prior, when the final proofs were being prepared. My breath hitched as I read the clinical, detached words. "Father, I've reviewed the final proofs. I believe we should remove the dedication to Mother entirely, along with any lingering references to her preliminary Andean fieldwork in the bibliography. Citing her early. Unpublished work will only complicate the narrative of your career's singular achievement. It's cleaner this way." Cleaner. The word was a surgeon's scalpel, cold and precise, cutting away the last vestiges of my contribution, my history, my very identity within the family I had built. It wasn't just about credit anymore. It was about legacy. And they had decided mine was a complication to be tidied up and thrown away. The chill from that single sheet of paper seemed to seep into my bones, extinguishing the last embers of hope that this had all been a terrible misunderstanding. It was a strategy, a coup. That night, as Julian and Amelia attended yet another celebratory faculty dinner, their laughter echoing in my mind, I made my decision. There would be no tearful confrontation, no dramatic note left on a pillow. They had communicated their verdict through silence and erasure, and I would respond in kind. I moved through the quiet house, no longer a ghost, but a determined shadow. Packing a single large suitcase, I didn't take the designer clothes Julian had bought me or the jewelry that felt like gilded cages on my skin. Instead, I packed my old dog-eared field journals, their pages filled with my own faded handwriting and pressed mountain flowers. I packed my dusty 35mm camera and the unpublished manuscripts that held the true, untainted seeds of their celebrated work. It wasn't an escape. It was a reclamation. I was taking back the pieces of myself they had left for dead. I went online and accessed a small investment account I had opened with a modest inheritance from my grandmother years ago. An account I had never mentioned to Julian, instinctively keeping one small thing that was solely mine. It had grown steadily, quietly, a secret nest egg for a future I never knew I would need so desperately. I liquidated the entire amount and transferred it to a new bank account under my maiden name, Rowan Vance. The sum was substantial enough for a new start. My final act before leaving was a quiet, symbolic gesture of release. I walked into the living room, to the large, elaborate aquarium Julian so prided himself on. A perfect, self-contained ecosystem he loved to control. I looked at my reflection in the glass, a pale, determined woman looking back at me, with a steady hand. I twisted the heavy platinum wedding band from my finger, the metal cool against my skin. I didn't place it on the mantelpiece for them to find. Instead, I opened the lid of the tank and let it drop into the water. It spiraled down, shimmering in the ethereal blue light, before settling silently on the brightly colored gravel, a treasure for the unblinking fish amidst their plastic castles, a disappearance without a word, an artifact for a lost civilization. The 5 years that followed were a lifetime compressed into a period of intense, solitary focus. I used the money to fund the one expedition I had always dreamed of, the one Julian had so casually dismissed as an academic dead end. I traveled to a remote, high-altitude village nestled deep in the Peruvian Andes, a place where the old ways still held sway, and the past was not a museum piece, but a living, breathing entity in the wind and the stones. The work was grueling, the conditions Spartan. There were days of loneliness so profound it felt like a physical ache, and weeks of frustration when the research led to nothing but impenetrable dead ends. But for every difficult moment, there was a moment of pure, unadulterated discovery that made my heart sing. I found myself again in the fragmented stories of ancient people, in the intricate symbolic patterns of their textiles, and in the quiet dignity of their descendants who shared their knowledge with me. I was no longer just a wife or a mother whose contributions were footnotes. I was a scientist, an anthropologist, a scholar in my own right, rediscovering the sharp edges of my own mind. I published my findings not as Rowan Croft, but under the name I was born with, the doctor, Rowan Vance, my first paper, on a previously undocumented form of quipu, a system of knotted cords used for record keeping, sent a small shockwave through the cloistered academic community. It challenged long-held assumptions and hinted at a level of societal complexity far greater than previously understood. The second paper, which detailed compelling evidence of a complex matriarchal society that predated the Inca Empire, caused a sensation. I was no longer a ghost. I was a voice, a presence, and my meticulously sourced work spoke for itself, loudly and clearly. And then, one crisp autumn afternoon, a thick cream-colored envelope, forwarded from my old university department, arrived at my small, rustic cabin. Inside was a lavish wedding invitation. Amelia was marrying the son of a prominent university dean. The invitation was handwritten in my daughter's elegant script, a calculated, almost cruel, gesture of inclusion. I knew it wasn't an olive branch. It was a summons, a final display of their victory, a chance for them to exhibit their perfect, successful life, now complete with a strategic marital alliance. They wanted me there, not as a mother, but as a vanquished ghost, a testament to their new world order. And I decided I would go. I arrived at the historic city cathedral, not in a gown designed to compete for attention, but in a simple, elegant navy blue dress that spoke of quiet confidence. My hair was styled simply, and my only jewelry was a pair of silver earrings I had bought from a village artisan in Peru. I was a stranger here now, an anthropologist observing a peculiar local ritual of the academic elite. I slipped into a pew at the very back, my presence unnoticed in the flurry of arriving guests, a quiet observer in the theater of their triumph. The cathedral was filled with the very people whose approval Julian and Amelia craved above all else. I recognized deans, department heads, and tenured professors, all chatting in hushed, reverent tones. Julian stood at the front, looking proud and regal, the benevolent patriarch presiding over his dynasty. Amelia was breathtaking, a vision in white lace, but as I watched her, I could see a brittle, anxious quality in her eyes that I recognized all too well, the desperate need to be seen as perfect. The organ music swelled to a crescendo, the heavy doors opened, and the ceremony began. A hush fell over the congregation as Amelia walked down the aisle on the arm of her father, the dean, the father of the groom, gave a speech filled with platitudes about the union of two great academic families. And then, just as the priest stepped forward to begin the formal rites, a strange thing happened. A single phone, then another, emitted a discreet buzz. A subtle electronic ripple spread through the pews. Heads began to dip as guests, unable to resist the pull of their devices, discreetly checked their screens. A low murmur started, growing from a confused whisper into a wave of excited chatter that broke the solemnity of the moment. I knew what it was. I had received the same email alert that morning. From my seat in the back, I watched as Julian's confident smile faltered, his eyes darting around, trying to understand the source of this unprecedented disruption. He caught the eye of a colleague in the front row, a history professor named Dr. Albright, who simply held up his phone, his face a mask of utter astonishment, and mouthed a single name, Rowan Vance. The news alert, sent out simultaneously to every member of the International Anthropological Society and picked up by major academic news outlets, was concise. Dr. Rowan Vance awarded the prestigious St. George Medal for her revolutionary discovery of a complete pre-Incan writing system, fundamentally altering our understanding of Andean history. In that moment, in that sacred space meant to celebrate my daughter's carefully curated future. It was my name, the name they had tried so hard to bury, and complications they had cleaned up. That was on everyone's lips. The ceremony concluded in a haze of confusion and forced smiles during the recessional. The air was thick with whispered conversations, not about the beautiful bride or the promising groom, but about the groundbreaking discovery and the reclusive, brilliant genius, Dr. Vance. As the guests began to file out into the bright afternoon, Julian finally saw me. He had been scanning the crowd, his face a storm of confusion and mounting irritation, and then his eyes locked on mine. He stopped dead in his tracks, the color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, grayish pallor. He walked toward me, his movements stiff and uncertain, a man suddenly lost in a world he thought he controlled perfectly. He stopped a few feet away, his hands, the same hands that had gestured so confidently at countless podiums, now trembling uncontrollably at his sides. "Rowan," he stammered, his voice a hoarse, incredulous whisper. "What? What did you do?" The question held no curiosity, no remorse, only the raw, terrified panic of a king whose carefully constructed empire was built on a foundation of lies and was now facing a seismic tremor. I really looked at him for the first time in 5 years. I saw not the brilliant scholar or the charming husband I had once adored, but a small, frightened man, terrified not of my anger, but of his own impending irrelevance. And I felt nothing, no rage, no bitterness, not even the sweet, sharp satisfaction of revenge I had once fantasized about. There was only a profound, quiet peace. I didn't owe him an answer. My life's work was my answer. My survival was my answer. The quiet hum of my name now echoing through his world was my answer. So I just smiled. It wasn't a smile of forgiveness or of triumph. It was the simple, serene smile of a woman who was finally, completely free. I turned my back on him, on the opulent wedding, on the ghost I used to be. I left Julian standing there, shaking and speechless, a statue in the ruins of his own making. As I walked out of the heavy cathedral doors and into the bright, open sunshine, my phone buzzed in my purse. It was a confirmation for my flight to London, where I was scheduled to accept my award, a new chapter, a new legacy, written entirely in my own name.